The UN Security Council held a meeting on the latest efforts to denuclearize the Korean peninsula. Some members said progress had been reported by North Korea in dismantling its nuclear program. However, the country is still unwilling to allow UN monitors to verify those claims. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, opens this portion of the meeting.
Good morning. The 8,353rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is non-proliferation, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Japan and the Republic of Korea to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you. Madam President, members of the Security Council, there have been several positive developments related to the nuclear weapon and ballistic missile programs of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea over recent months. On 20 April, the DPRK announced an immediate halt to nuclear explosive testing and flight tests of certain longer-range ballistic missiles. On 24 May, the DPRK reportedly dismantled its Pyongyang nuclear test site. The DPRK also reportedly dismantled missile-related infrastructure at the Ihari missile test stand in May and the Sohae satellite launching site in July. International experts, however, were not invited to witness any of these activities. In the meantime, there continue to be signs the DPRK is maintaining and developing its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs. The International Atomic Energy Agency remains unable to access the DPRK and verify the correctness and completeness of the DPRK's declarations under its Safeguards Agreement. The agency continues to monitor developments through commercially available satellite imagery where possible. In his regular report to the IAEA Board of Governors and General Conference submitted on 20 August, the IAEA Director General reported that the agency had observed signatures consistent with the continued operation of the plutonium production reactor, radiochemical laboratory, and alleged uranium enrichment facility at Yongbyon. Madam President, the Secretary General has welcomed the commitment made by Chairman Kim Jong-un of the State Affairs Commission of the DPRK on 5 September to realize the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. It is hoped that the positive developments, together with important summits between the leaders of the DPRK and the Republic of Korea and between the DPRK and the United States, respectively, will contribute to an atmosphere conducive to advancing sustainable peace and complete and verifiable denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula in accordance with relevant Security Council resolutions. Security Council unity helped create the opportunity to engage diplomatically. A year ago, the Korean Peninsula was the most tense and dangerous peace and security issue in the world. Today, progress has been made on building trust, reducing military tensions, and opening or reopening channels of communications. A foundation has been established to make tangible progress on the core issues. We encourage all member states to support the parties in their diplomatic efforts and to ensure the full implementation of the relevant Security Council resolutions. Madam President, I've been asked to brief today on the United Nations Command, which is also referred to as the Unified Command. Security Council Resolution 84 of 7 July 1950 recommended that all member states providing military forces and other assistance to the Republic of Korea should, and I quote, make such forces and other assistance available to a unified command under the United States of America, end quote, and requested the United States to designate the commander of such forces. The same resolution also authorized the unified command at its discretion to use the United Nations flag in the course of its operations concurrently with the flags of the various nations participating. In its first report to the Security Council on the operation of the command, the United States informed the Security Council that on 25 July 1950, the Unified Command was established and the Security Council first used the name United Nations Command in Resolution 88 of 8 November 1950. Notwithstanding its name, the United Nations Command is not a United Nations operation or body, nor does it come under the command and control of the United Nations. Furthermore, it was not established as a subsidiary organ of the Security Council and is not funded through the United Nations budget. As such, there are no reporting lines between the United Nations Command and the United Nations Secretariat. Madam President, the Secretary General, during the upcoming high-level week of the United Nations General Assembly, will discuss how he and the United Nations system can further support the parties and how steps can be advanced towards sustainable peace, security, and complete and verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula in accordance with Security Council resolutions. He hopes that the Inter-Korean Summit, starting in a few hours, as well as the planned summit between the leaders of the United States and the DPRK, will further contribute to this process. Thank you.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of the United States. Whether international sanctions succeed or fail depends on the difference between words and deeds. Sanctions are just words on a page, unless they are effectively enforced. Russia originally called for this meeting to discuss the implementation of sanctions against North Korea. Then they evidently changed their mind. But we thought the issue was important enough to bring forward and have a briefing. The United States welcomes the chance to examine the difference between words and deeds. We welcome the opportunity to see whether Security Council's efforts to eliminate North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile programs are being honored and enforced, and if not, why? The measures we adopted last year are something the Security Council should be very proud of. We achieved historic unity implementing historic sanctions. The Security Council unanimously adopted 3 major sanctions packages, creating one of the most restrictive sanctions regimes in history. Together, we have also implemented sanctions against dozens of specific North Korean individuals and entities supporting the regime's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. All of us pledged a ban on North Korean exports and 30% of its imports. All of us promised to uphold the expulsion of all North Korean overseas laborers and stop all joint ventures. We supported a cap on North Korea's imports of oil and other refined petroleum products at 500,000 barrels a year, and a total ban on the export of North Korean coal. We all promised to expel North Korean overseas financial representatives. We agreed North Korea should not be able to obtain chemical and biological weapons-related materials. And we all agreed to stop international scientific engagements with North Korea. These sanctions were put in place for a very specific reason: to cut off funding and materials for North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile programs, because we know that the cash revenue going to North Korea is used to build its weapons programs, not to help the North Korean people. The difficult, very sensitive talks with North Korea are ongoing. The Trump-Kim summit has set us on a path toward complete denuclearization. But we're not there yet. And until we get there, we must not ease the powerful worldwide sanctions that are in place. It is important to note that, like the rest of the Security Council, Russia voted in favor of all of the sanctions I just described. Despite this, and despite not having yet come close to the achievement of denuclearization, Russia is now asking to ease the sanctions. Russia originally requested this meeting for the purpose of criticizing the United States for blocking rail projects it wants to pursue with North Korea. Russia planned on asking the Security Council to begin to remove sanctions on North Korea so it could pursue a project for its own economic benefit. The question one should ask is why? Why, after voting for sanctions 11 different times, is Russia now backing away from them? We know the answer. It's because Russia has been cheating. And now they've been caught. Despite its repeated support for UN sanctions, Russia is actively working to undermine the enforcement of the Security Council's sanctions on North Korea. Its violations are not one-offs. They are systematic. Russia has not simply looked the other way as its nationals and entities engage in activities explicitly prohibited by UN sanctions. Russia has engaged in a concerted campaign in the Security Council to cover up violations of sanctions, whether they're committed by Russia or citizens of other states. The United States has evidence of consistent and wide-ranging Russian violations. This should offend every current and former member of the Security Council who knows how difficult it was to gain passage of these sanctions. And it should offend every country that has felt the looming threat of North Korean nuclear weapons. One of the main ways North Korea cheats is through ship-to-ship transfers of banned items, mainly oil, but increasingly coal and other goods. To evade port inspections, oil tankers come together over the high seas. North Koreans use hoses to transfer refined petroleum products to their ships to bring back home. Many tankers are willing to provide oil to make a quick buck. One Russian vessel, called the Patriot, was captured on film transferring refined petroleum to a North Korean-controlled vessel in April of this year that is UN listed. The Patriot helped the North Koreans evade sanctions by allowing them to obtain oil on the high seas without having to dock into a port, since the North Korean boat was subject to a global port entry ban. With our allies and partners, the United States has evidence of many more ships we have uncovered providing oil illegally through ship-to-ship transfers. Just this year, the United States tracked at least 148 instances of oil tankers delivering refined petroleum products obtained through illegal ship-to-ship transfers. We estimate that at least North Korea has obtained over 800,000 barrels of refined petroleum products in the first 8 months of this year. That's 160% of the 2018 annual cap of 500,000. In reality, we think they've obtained 4 times the annual quota in the first 8 months of this year. We presented evidence of these violations to the 1718 committee that tracks sanctions implementation. But Russia prevented the committee from declaring that North Korea exceeded its oil quota. Today, North Korea continues to illegally procure refined petroleum products with the help of Russia. Not only that, when we pursued UN designation of the Patriot and other North Korean, Russian, and other country-flagged ships that have been found to be illegally transferring oil, Russia consistently blocked these designations in the Sanctions Committee. And it's not just on the high seas that Russia is aiding sanctions evasion. When North Korea assassinated Kim Jong-nam with VX, a deadly nerve agent, the United States moved to strengthen UN controls on the flow of chemical and biological weapons technology of North Korea. Russia agreed with us in the Security Council, but turned around and again blocked the Sanctions Committee from updating its 12-year-old sanctions list, a list that is critical to preventing the flow of dangerous weapons of mass destruction-related materials to North Korea. When North Korea began developing ICBMs to target the United States and other nations with nuclear weapons, we tried to stop them. But even when it came to denying North Korea the means to deliver nuclear weapons, the Russians resisted enforcement of the sanctions. The list goes on. Russia agreed with the rest of the Security Council 1 year ago to sanction a North Korean operative in Moscow who was raising money for weapons programs. But it never expelled this operative, and when it came time to act, Russia not only fought to allow the operative to remain in its country, but it's fighting for him to retain access to his Moscow bank account. For what? To finance his illegal operations in Russia in violation of the UN sanctions? Step by step, sanction by sanction, and time again, Russia is working across the board to undermine the sanctions regime. Last month, the independent panel of experts on the implementation of North Korean sanctions submitted its biannual report to the Sanctions Committee. The report contained evidence of multiple Russian sanction violations. We have seen and read this report. But when the panel submitted the report to the Security Council last week, we noticed something deeply troubling. The evidence of Russian violations that was detailed in the earlier report was missing. It had been removed from the open section of the report. Apparently, Russia threatened to prevent release of the report unless its demands to hide the evidence of its violations was met. To our deep regret, the panel agreed. This Russian interference was so egregious that the United States had no choice but to prevent the publication of the tainted report. The UN panel of experts reporting process is our most valuable tool in ensuring that sanctions are implemented fully and effectively. It gives the Security Council and the world an impartial, independent means of ensuring accountability for violators and a warning to anyone who is considering violation sanctions in the future. We've seen this Russian tendency to kill the messengers of inconvenient truths before. They didn't like it when the Joint Investigative Mechanism concluded that their client, the Assad regime, used chemical weapons against its own people in Syria, so they just killed the mechanism. Now Russia has succeeded in discrediting the UN independent panel reporting process because it called out their violations. Russian corruption is like a virus. It is impeding our ability to achieve complete denuclearization in North Korea. Now it is spread to the sanctions reporting process. If we're not careful, the sickness will make its way to the integrity and effectiveness of the Security Council itself. Finally, let's look at why Russia is so focused on developing railways with North Korea. So focused that it will tell us today we should remove sanctions. Russia's Far East region has few economic opportunities, but coal is one of them. Exporting coal has been easy without a warm water seaport. So Russians have been leasing the North Korean port of Rajin. It poured a lot of money into building this port. We knew it was important for Russia, so we exempted it 5 times since 2016. But that's not enough for Russia. It wants sanctions relief so it can connect its Trans-Siberian Railway into North Korea to ultimately reach a global port in South Korea. The problem is, it isn't time yet to relieve the pressure on North Korea, no matter how lucrative it is for Russia. As we have all agreed to, that time comes with denuclearization, not before. Now is the wrong time to undo all the good work we've done in the Security Council. Now is the wrong time to ease sanctions pressure on the North Korean regime by repealing sanctions. And it's never the right time to allow cheating to go unpunished. Every time the Security Council overlooks sanctions violation, every time we allow the Russians to bury evidence of violations, we remove incentives of Pyongyang to end its nuclear program. The evidence we presented today leaves Russia with a choice. It's binary. Either it wants sanctions to succeed or it doesn't. Either it wants to deprive the Pyongyang government of the means to finance its illegal nuclear weapon system, or it doesn't. Unfortunately, I think we know the answers to these questions. Either way, the Security Council can no longer be indifferent to Russia's actions. Russia must cease its violations of North Korean sanctions. It must end its concerted effort to cover up evidence of sanctions violations. The final, fully verified denuclearization of North Korea is the international community's overriding objective. The evidence no longer allows us to take Russia's word that it shares this objective. Russia must now demonstrate by its deeds that it shares our objective in North Korea. The United States calls on all members of the Security Council to join us in demanding that the panel of experts submit its original report to the Security Council. Every member of this council should go on the record on this request. Nothing less than the integrity of the United Nations and our unified approach to North Korea hang in the balance.
Thank you, Madam President. I also would like to start, similar to my colleagues, with expressing my deep condolences to all of those who suffered from natural disasters here in the United States, in China, and the Philippines. I wanted to thank Ms. DiCarlo for the briefing she provided us with. Madam President, you suggested that we hold a Security Council meeting today in an open format. All the better, because we wanted to draw the attention of the Council to the fact that Russia, China, and other members of the Council have, on many occasions since the time there's been an outlined progress in Korean conciliation, we have tried to initiate any kind of a positive reaction from the Council to these events. Just to remember that half a year ago, we used to meet here sometimes twice a week in order to discuss yet another ballistic launch by Pyongyang. But today, we are already talking about the prospect of signing a peace treaty and the final rapprochement between the North and South. I would like to have the American delegation explain to us and all other members of the UN, why are you against a Council presidential statement in support of these positive developments? You are blocking even such a reaction as press elements. You reject any kind of a positive statement. We have said many a times that we're fully in support of the negotiating process which started between the interested parties in the beginning of this year. Russia welcomes also the outcome of what has already been done. There has been lowered military activity. There is now a direct contact between the leaders of DPRK, the Republic of Korea, and the United States. Several days ago, the city of Kherson saw the opening of a liaison office for the two Koreas. We also wish the success for the summit to start tomorrow between the leaders of DPRK and the Republic of Korea in Pyongyang. At the same time, we're witnessing today is that the negotiations between DPRK and the United States, at the very least, are encountering certain difficulties. The negotiating process is a two-way street. Diplomacy in the 21st century is such, and any century is such, that it is impossible to come to an agreement if you offer nothing in return for your demands. No one is trying to question the fact that the fact that the DPRK is having a nuclear missile program is unacceptable. But what can we expect when Pyongyang is being called upon to unconditionally comply with all of the conditions against against the guarantee of empty promises? The world has already had the measure of their price in May, where the administration of the United States decided that the agreements on the JCPOA was not good, and they decided to leave them unilaterally. And this way, promises made to Tehran international community were broken. The path to denuclearization has to start with strengthening confidence-building measures, and one such measure could, for example, be signing a peace treaty, which would put an end to the war in Korea. And we can see that both Pyongyang and Seoul have already come very close to this. Restrictive measures which were introduced by the Security Council resolutions against DPRK cannot be an end in itself. They have to be an instrument and tool in order to involve the country in constructive negotiations. Resolving the nuclear issue of the peninsula through just sanctions and pressure on Pyongyang is impossible. Sanctions cannot replace diplomacy. Now, on the situation with the 1718 Sanctions Committee. The United States delegation intentionally heightened the tension surrounding the issue of transferring to the Council of the interim report by the panel of experts, and they want to use this tribune in order to impose on the international community their own vision of the situation. The meeting we are having today, as has been the case recently with our American colleagues, have become a meeting on Russia rather than DPRK. What is being said that the Russians are trying to exert pressure on the panel of experts. Well, we would like to once and for all put an end to such insinuations. In actual fact, what is happening is this. The work of the panel of experts, which because of decisions beyond our control became increasingly politicized, they became ultimately the hostages to the vision of Washington. The panel has to be guided by the principles of objectivity and impartiality. Unfortunately, the document that they've prepared in its first version did not meet those standards. In this regard, we and other members of the committee expressed a number of comments which were viewed correctly by the experts and then taken on board when they transferred the report to the Security Council. The rules of procedure of the committee provide for consultations with member states when it comes to the contents of the report. Do not look for ill intent in the fact that the part of the report that has to do with countries immediately involved, and we're therefore not indifferent to it. What experts do is that they send requests and queries to us, and it's logically that the responses we provide need to be reflected in the content of the report. Unfortunately, in this case, exactly the opposite happened. Russia consistently asked the questions that the panel sent us, including answers to the accusations that were levied against us today by the permanent representative of the United States. Our viewpoint was not taken into account, unsurprisingly, therefore, that we insisted on having our position reflected in the document. Once again, let me underscore this fact again. We were not trying to exert pressure on the panel of experts. We were trying to abide by the rules of procedure of the 1718 Sanctions Committee. I do hope that not a single one of you questions the fact that if accusations are provided, well, then equally transparently, what we need to have is reactions to such accusations. And that's precisely why the Russian delegation insisted on making sure that our position be reflected in the report in question. Through difficult negotiating efforts, we thought that we came up with a compromise solution. Once again, this was not a difficult conversation, but at all stages of the conversation, we managed to come up with an agreement with all of the interested parties, including the American delegation. The American PR, in her emotional statement, did not tell you that there was an agreement to our compromise on the part of your experts as well. Now, what changed the next day when you recalled it? I do hope that you do understand that the situation today is such that it is your delegation who banned the conveyance of the panel of experts report to the Security Council. And you are the ones who are preventing the publication of an independent report of the state of plays with the sanctions against the PKK because you blocked the dissemination of it in its new version. Once again, this was signed by all of the experts in the group, including the American one. You are preventing the possibility of reflecting the viewpoints that do not coincide with the opposition. Well, here a question begs to be asked. Aren't you the ones who are exerting direct pressure on the group, demanding that they change their opinion in the report that they will convey to the Security Council? The ball now is in your court. You are presenting this as an egregious precedent, which is violating the independent nature of the panel. But the situation is exactly the opposite. Introducing changes to the report of the panel of experts is a perfectly normal practice for the deliberations of a subsidiary body of the Council. Would like to underscore here that no one is trying to undermine the independence of the experts, but let's not forget that they do not work in a vacuum. We need to avoid situations where legitimate requests of the governments are not taken into account. Now, let me repeat myself a little bit. First of all, on the Patriot ship oil tanker, the group of experts themselves said that the ship was not in violation of the sanctions regime. This is in a report in the original version thereof. Secondly, now that we removed the section on the violations by a Russian company, this is a falsehood. This is in the report in an unchanged, except that it's in a confidential appendix with more detailed information. Third, on the quotas and the funding for the DPRK representative in Russia. We requested additional information on that and confirmation of that from the United States and are still waiting for that information from them. On the quotas, we've been waiting for 2 months now. On the DPRK representative, 4 months. So who is trying to deceive the international community here? Who is trying to cheat on the international community? Who is disseminating lies? Madam President, now, on the sanctions resolutions of DPRK, he would like to draw attention to the recent events on the peninsula. Some time ago, the so-called UN command, well, don't be deceived by the name today, as this was confirmed by the Secretary of Briefing, this is a military structure which is based on the leadership of the United States in the demilitarized area between the two Koreas, using the name of their organization as a shield. They blocked the attempts to resume railroad connections between the two countries. But bringing the two railroads together is one of the key inter-Korean agreements which are endorsed in the Panmunjom Declaration. As far as we know, the specialists from both countries were not allowed by the command to take a view and assess the state of tracks. Of course, the press started commenting and saying that the UN is blocking the implementation of joint inter-Korean projects. We're grateful to you, Madam President, for an in-depth economic analysis of the issues that the Russian Far East is facing. At the same time, I would like to remind you that the cooperation between the UN, railroad roads, including the trilateral Hassan Regime project, is not covered by the sanctions regimes, including the Security Council Resolution 2397. You should, instead of creating roadblocks, promote the inter-Korean cooperation and dialogue. But Washington is prepared to sacrifice any kind of hope for inter-Korean dialogue. The UN command, what is it? Is it an analog to the Berlin Wall in the 21st century? What is being done by the United States can be considered as violations under Security Council resolutions enshrined in all resolutions when we're talking about finding a peaceful settlement for the conflict. On the other hand, all of these steps are fully in line with the policy of exerting maximal pressure on Pyongyang. The United States are becoming increasingly aggressive in trying to subjugate the Security Council. Sometimes we're left with the impression that in Washington they're confusing the UN Security Council and the National Security Council of the United States. And the meeting today is no exception to that, unfortunately. I would like to also yet once again draw your attention to the status of the so-called UN troops in Korea. The commander of these troops is at the same time the commander of the U.S. forces in Korea and the joint U.S. Republic of Korea Command. From the viewpoint of international law, under the conditions when in 1991 the two states became fully fledged members of the UN, maintaining the command in Korea, which confirms that entity as the UN as a belligerent party to that, is illegally, from legal viewpoint, is nonsense. Under current conditions, when the DPRK is officially stating that they are trying to prevent a new conflict and calling upon for a declaration to end the war on the peninsula and sign a peace treaty, what we need to do is analyze the role and the need for such troops. They were determined in the 50s under Security Council resolutions 84 and 85. They were passed against a specific historic context. The USSR at the time boycotted that meeting, and Kuomintang was sitting in the place of the People's Republic of China. Basically, they have nothing to do with the UN, so we therefore need to consider the possibility of withdrawing them. The decision of the 30th GA provided for the possibility of the disbanding of the troops in 1966 and replacing them with the Korean border posts in case there would be future normalization. The institutions and mechanisms of the UN and Security Council should be used to support the settlement rather than becoming roadblocks to them. The general goal of all of those involved is to make sure that we peacefully settle the issues in the region, including the nuclear issue, on the basis of the dialogue and mutually acceptable agreement. And the development of inter-Korean cooperation is in line with this goal and shows that the DPRK's course as of the beginning of this year to normalize their relations with neighbors and denuclearize the peninsula is correct. Let me underscore the fact that this kind of cooperation is not to be in violation of Security Council resolutions. Discussing the project of future cooperations and future research projects are not in violation of that. As Security Council and its decisions should help rapprochement between North and South rather than impede them. I suggest the Security Council members consider this creating special conditions on the 17-18 commissions for the request for temporary exemption from the sanctions regime for the implementation of inter-Korean cooperation projects. As far as I know, both sides to the DMZ line share this idea. The Sanctions Committee of the Security Council on DPRK is a very good example of what could result from a destructive behavior on some of its parts. The committee is being seen, it would seem, by the U.S. as a sledgehammer with which to punish the DPRK for their intransigence. And this is very convenient, using the Security Council in order to exert pressure on DPRK. Washington is methodically refusing member states and international organizations in conducting humanitarian and diplomatic and sports links which have nothing to do with nuclear and or missile program. Requests sent by the American colleagues do not justify because they think that this to be considered by others as the absolute in the last resort, which means that the committee in a position where consensus decisions, even technical ones, are becoming impossible. In conclusion, Madam President, we would like to urge on all the countries to restraint and show that looking for political and diplomatic settlement is the only way to peacefully settle the issues on the political peninsula and creating in Southeast Asia stable mechanism for security, which is in the interest of all countries in the region. Only sanctions, only exerting pressure on Pyongyang without taking into account its legitimate interests, this will be impossible. Once again, I would like to your attention to the fact that this is how Russia, together with China, developed their roadmap for the settlement of the situation in the Korean Peninsula. And this roadmap, de facto, albeit with certain setbacks, is now being implemented. The Russian side stands ready to closest possible cooperation with all interested countries in order to ensure peace and stability in the region, make sure there's comprehensive settlement of the issues of the Korean Peninsula on the basis of equal and non-discriminatory negotiations with the participation of all interested states. I thank you.
I thank the representative from the Russian Federation. I shall now make a further statement in my capacity as the representative of the United States. Deny, distract, and lie. We have heard this same song many times before, whether it was aiding the Assad regime with chemical weapons, whether it was the attempted murder of the Skripals with a dangerous nerve agent in the United Kingdom, whether it was election meddling in the United States, which didn't work, by the way, and now you've been cheating on sanctions agreements and have gotten caught. Lying, cheating, and rogue behavior has become the new norm of the Russian culture. The Russian ambassador said, quote, "No one is denying the panel of experts." Well, then I take that to assume that you will allow the original report of the panel of experts to be released.